Good evening. So, yes, Lonnie Jones was supposed to be here tonight, and you're stuck with me instead. I understand. I don't think I've stood in front of such a disappointed group of people since the 7th grade spelling bee. When you're standing in front of the entire school in 7th grade and you spell the word bikini with an A, it doesn't matter where you put the A. They're going to be disappointed in you. And so I am thankful for the chance to be here and excited about the opportunity. I know that this topic was one that was kind of chosen by Lonnie, and I'm going to try to take my own perspective with it and on it. So I'd like to ask you to open to Ephesians, the book of Ephesians. The theme is one another. I love the idea. I love when Ricky, talked about how this whole year you're thinking about the one another. There's these 30 some odd passages in the Bible, in the New Testament, about one another, love one another, and all these other things where the Bible specifically tells us, what we are to do with and for one another. And so the topics this summer are where the Bible says, do this with one another, do that for one another, do this to one another. And so I'm looking through the topic and I'm like, okay, well, all you have to do is do a Bible search for walk with one another. And that's not in the Bible. The Bible doesn't say walk with one another. So I'm kind of getting a little creative and maybe coloring outside of the lines just a little bit, but I hope that you'll bear with me kind of as we think about it a little bit. Ephesians does talk a lot about walking. And in fact, several times in 5-6 chapters, it talks about walking. And so I wanted to start by noting how Paul uses this term walk as a metaphor, as a picture and image for how we live individually, and then we can begin to pull it into the one another stuff. Just very quickly, in Ephesians chapter 5, it says in verse number 15 that we need to look carefully or take care how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of the time. And so walking, for Paul in this letter to the Ephesians is going to have something to do with, being circumspect, being wise, making good choices, the path that you choose, the path that you're on. What does that path entail? The way that it works in the book of Ephesians is this. Chapter 2, verse number 2 is the first place that Paul uses the word walk. He says in Ephesians 2, you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince of the power of the air, the spirit that is now at work in the sons of disobedience, among whom we all once lived. And so he says you follow someone. When it talks about walking, the way that you walk has to do, first of all, with who you are following. You used to follow the prince of the power of the air. You were following the course or the way of this world. And he says you don't need to walk that way anymore. So you need to walk wisely. Don't be unwise. Don't follow the course, the path of the world. Don't follow the world or the prince of this world, the prince of the power of the air. So what do we do? Well, look down just a couple more verses. Still in chapter 2, verse number 10. When he says in verse 8, by grace you have been saved through faith. It is not your own doing, it's the gift of God. And verse 9 says, not a result of works, so that no one can boast. So you don't have to worry about doing good anymore. You don't have to worry about good works because there's no reason for it. That's not what Paul says. I know some people that take that tack, that take that path, and they say, it has nothing to do with what you do or how you live your life at all. You're just saved by grace through faith. But what's the very next verse? We find the word walk here. We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So the good works are there. It's like, I'm thinking about these video games that I used to play when I was a kid, right? And I'm dating myself, but when we had this little joystick and you just had to go up or down, and that was it. That was all it was about, right? And you had this path that you're supposed to take and you're supposed to follow. And if you knew the right places to go, you could find these things along the path, these things along the route, and you could get them and they would help you and they would follow you and they would do good things, or they would help you on your journey. And Paul says, look, God is dotting your path with good things, with good works. And He's hoping that when you get to that part of your journey, that you will have the wisdom to see it, that you'll have the strength to do it, that you'll have the courage to step in it or walk in it. That's how we walk. But he doesn't stop there. In chapter 4, we get 2 different references to walking. And this, I believe, is where Brother Lonnie was going with this material. Because he says in chapter 4, verse number 1, as a prisoner of the Lord, I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called. You need to walk in a manner worthy of your calling, what God has called you to do. And what does that look like? How does that work? Well, we're going to talk about some of that in this passage, in this section. But at the end of the section, he bookends it by going back to walking in verse 17. So he starts off by saying, I want you to walk worthy. And then he bookends it. He says, all right, that's the thought in verse 17. I say this, I testify in the Lord, no longer walk as the Gentiles do in the futility of their minds. In other words, verse 22, put off the old self. It belongs to your former manner of life. There's your quote. What does it mean to walk a certain way? That is your manner of life. This is your lifestyle. Okay? Some people are walking in one direction and then they will surprise you to death by doing something completely uncharacteristic. Has that ever happened to you? You know somebody, you have a friend, or you see somebody, and you expect, because of their current lifestyle, because of the current way that they're walking, to make a certain choice or to do a certain thing, and then they surprise everybody and they go over here and do something totally different because it's uncharacteristic. This is not the manner of their life. See, when Paul says you walk a certain way, you have a lifestyle. You have your habits. You have your preferences. You have the cereal that you like to eat. You have the coffee that you like to drink a certain way. You have your daily routine. You have the things that you like. You have the things that you don't like. That is your manner of life. Paul in Ephesians will say that's your walk. Now, your walk needs to be concentrated in a specific way, in a good way. And so in chapter 4, he says, walk this way. In chapter 5, verse number 2, he says, walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us. In chapter 5 and verse number 8, he says, at one time you were darkness, but now you are light in the world. Walk as children of light. When you read the book of Ephesians, for the rest of your life, pay attention to how whatever you're reading connects to the concept of walking. How does it fit with the manner of life that you are leading? Who are you following? What course are you on? Who is with you on that road? Walking together. Walking with one another. That's the key. You see, in Ephesians chapter 4, this section between verses 1 and 17, when it talks about the manner of life that you walk, he focuses on how much of that walk is with other people. I urge you. What is he urging them to do? What is this walk needing to entail? What is he begging them to do? Verse number 2, walk with all humility and gentleness and patience, bearing with one another in love. Verse number 3, and you guys have talked about this verse, right, Ricky? You've used this verse this year. Eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. You see, when we're all walking in a worthy manner, you will be surprised at how we walk together. We walk with one another. There's the famous passage in Amos chapter 3. I thought it was fitting that it came from the book of Amos, because that's my claim to fame at Wood Avenue. That's why I get invited back. It's because I did one good sermon. In 11 years, I know I've got one good sermon. Can two walk together unless they be agreed? Amos chapter 3 and verse number 3. Do we share the road together? Can we share the road together unless we are in agreement? When you think about the idea of walking with one another, and so I hope, I'm really big on these, big studies. I love how Ricky has, this year we're looking at one another. This series in the summer is unfolding some of these things. And so it's all supposed to be connected, guys. I really hope that each week you're not just hearing the one individual lesson as a single episode, but you're seeing it as part of an arcing story, of an arcing theme, and how they connect to one another. Because that's what's going to make it so important. When you talk about one another, that should now begin to bring up certain images in your head, because you have been training your mind to think about one another in some very specific biblical ways. So now we come to a part where this one's not there. This one is not a specific biblical phrase where a Bible author says, walk with one another in unity or in anything. So what does that conjure? What does that mean? As you've been thinking about this, I came up with 3 ideas about what it means to walk with one another. The first one is the most basic. Just going in the same direction. That's what I think Amos, chapter 3 is talking about. Can two people share the road? Can two people, go the same direction? I had an opportunity a few years ago to hike part of the Appalachian Trail. If you're not familiar with the Appalachian Trail, thousands of miles. It's the longest marked trail, continuous trail in North America, and it starts in Georgia and it goes all the way up into Maine. And it's huge. And so I went and I did like this much of it. I just did a couple of miles. But I passed these people on the trail, and I had stopped because my legs quit working after about 3 miles. And they were on like a multi-month journey. And they were, they were just, you could tell they were traveling together. And so I was in the fetal position on the side of the trail. And I seriously thought about just leaving my backpack on the side of I don't need that anymore. But I didn't. So these guys stopped to make sure I was breathing, right? Good Samaritan. And we talked a little bit. They didn't actually know each other. They knew each other a little bit because they both got to a point one evening where they both stopped at the same campsite on the Appalachian Trail. There's shelters, there's areas, there's little places. And so they wound up being there, and so they struck up camp together that night. And it's a pretty common occurrence for people to just, we're going to share a campfire, we'll cook food together, we'll just hang out. Well, it turned out they had a lot in common. They took about the same pace. And so the next morning when they got up, instead of just saying, well, it was nice to meet you, bye, they shared the trail. They helped one another out. They shared resources. They swapped stories. They got to know each other more. They were going in the same direction. They had the same ideas and goals in mind. And so they helped one another along the way. And I was thinking, that would be really great. Right now, if somebody could pick me up, carry me back down this mountain, right? You're familiar with the military tactic. I think Napoleon was either the inventor or the one who made it most popular. But, he comes up with this idea of divide and conquer, right? When we've got people who are trying to do something together, if you want to destroy that, if you want to break that up, you don't necessarily have to come in from outside and be an overwhelming force. You may not be able to overwhelm those united people. But if you can cause division among the ranks, if you can cause some kind of cancer to grow from the inside and spread and break up that union, break up that fellowship, break up that moving in the same direction, then infighting will take a city down from the inside faster than any army can lay siege to it. But more than just going in the same direction, there's the idea of being united with one another, being of the same mind. In 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 14, 2 Corinthians 6:14 is the passage where it talks about not being unequally yoked. And it says with unbelievers, it uses the terms partnership and fellowship there to talk about, look, it's not just about being in the same space with somebody. It's about being on the same page. There's a story told about these two guys who are riding a tandem bicycle, right? The bicycle, the old song, Daisy, Daisy, give me your introduce, right? A bicycle built for two, right? That's all it is. That's all I was trying to get to, was the bicycle built for two. So you got the bicycle, and there's a rider in the front. He's got the steering wheel and the pedals, and then there's a rider behind him who's got handlebars that don't do anything, but he's got his own set of pedals, so they work together. And they had been going down this road, and they'd been having a pretty good ride so far, but they came to this section where the road inclined steeply, and it just went uphill, and it seemed like it went on forever. And so they get going, and Jim's in the front, Bob's in the back, and Jim is saying, all right, Bob, we can do this. And he's pedaling furiously, and he's focused on the road ahead, and he's thinking about what's going to be at the top. But it is just the hardest climb he's ever made in his entire life. And they pedal for what seemed like hours, and he just keeps pushing and keeps pressing, and they keep until they finally get to the top. And they have to stop. And Jim turns around and looks at Bob and says, I cannot believe how hard it was to climb that hill. And Bob says, I feel the exact same way. Could you imagine what would have happened if I hadn't had the brakes on the whole time? They were facing the same direction, but they had two different goals. Bob was trying to keep them from sliding backwards. He thought he was doing a good thing, but he was making the work harder. There's some times in our lives, the people around us, we want them to make our lives easier. We're supposed to be making our lives better, but we are dragging each other down. We are unequally yoked. But walking with one another brings up a third idea in my mind that I think is crucial for us to understand. Sometimes we need people to go through things with us. Do you remember when Job lost everything and his children were killed and his life was on the brink of ending, and he had 3 guys who came from opposite corners of the known world, traveling by foot or by camel hundreds of miles to come visit him. And when they got there, they were so shocked at what they saw, they couldn't even recognize him, that they just sat with him. They just went through it with him. Now, unfortunately, that's not all they did. We get a whole book going through the problems that they created when they stopped trying to walk with Job through what he was going through and started trying to tell Job how to fix his life, and made mistake after mistake after mistake. Hear the words of Psalm 23. Yea, though I, what? Walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art what? With me. With me. Has there ever been a time in your life that you can think of when you felt like there was nobody with you? That you were doing it on your own? That you were by yourself? That can make any burden seem impossible to carry. And yet, if just one person can come sit with you, can just be there, doesn't have to even fix it. They don't even have to have the right answers. They don't even have to have a solution. They just have to go through it with you. Then you can take that next step. You can do that next thing. And when we walk with one another through that, then we can keep going. The catchphrase today is to do life together. We do life together. We live together. And here's the problem. We are not very good at doing life together in our current state of affairs. The way the world is set up right now, the way our culture is set up right now, you have to go through a screen to get to another human being, right? You know what I'm saying. We are disconnected at a fundamental level. And it is doing fundamental damage to our brains and our psyches and our emotional well-being. This is now a well-documented fact. You can go find multiple studies that are demonstrating, proving, and explaining the same phenomena that happens over and over again. Virtual connection is no substitute because we're not actually doing life together anymore. That's why we need to be in this room together as often as we can. That's why we need to be together outside of this room as often as we can. I'm talking with Josh about heading up to Colorado next month. You're going to do life together with some people, right? You're going to be out in the woods, right? Most everybody's going to come out of those woods, right? You know, a sports team, they've got to gel with one another in order to be successful on the field. And so most good coaches recognize we've got to figure out how to get these players to gel with each other off the field first. If we've got internal conflicts, if we've got somebody who thinks that they're better than somebody else and they can't get along with each other and they can't stand to be in the same room with each other, it's going to show up in the game. And so we've got to figure out how to walk with one another. We've got to share our lives with one another. When we learn to do that, then the world won't be able to tear us apart. A neat quote that I found by Vance Havner said, "Snowflakes are frail, tiny things. But if enough of them get together, they can stop traffic." And it doesn't take that many in Alabama, does it? Right? Individually, there's not a lot there. But together, moving in the same direction, helping one another out, you can do things that seem impossible. So Ephesians is talking about this unity, and it talks about the one Lord, one faith, one baptism. It talks about the unity that we're supposed to have. And it says that as we mature, we grow up into the fullness of Christ. We're no longer children tossed to and fro by the waves. This is Ephesians 4 and verse 14. We're not children. We've grown up. We're no longer tossed by the waves. We're no longer carried about by every wind of doctrine or human cunning or craftiness of deceitful schemes. But speaking the truth in love, we grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it's equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. The idea of the body, it's here in Ephesians chapter 4, Romans chapter 12, and 1 Corinthians chapter 12. There is a crucial key idea to walking with one another in the image of the body that Paul uses 3 separate times that we also need to hang on to. It's the difference between union, unity, and uniformity. Now again, the theme is unity. You guys have had lessons on unity, and I'm trying to kind of stay away from that. But we need to recognize the difference between those three terms. And we need to pick which one the church is supposed to be. Is the church supposed to be a union? Is the church supposed to be a unity? Or is the church supposed to be a uniformity? Because those three words, they all kind of have the same root idea in them. But they are very different concepts. You know, think about a union. Is the church just supposed to be a union of a bunch of different people? I mean, you can create different unions in different ways. You can take two cats and you can tie their tails together with a string and throw them over a clothesline, and you'll have a union of two cats. But I don't think you're going to have much unity. I don't think you're going to have much good coming out of that union. So there's got to be something more going on. But if you swing the pendulum too far, then you get to uniformity. When you have a group of people that is uniform, right, I think of like military terminology, right? I think about everybody lined up in rows, everybody equidistant apart from each other, everybody standing the exact same way, everybody dressed the exact same way, the haircut is the exact same haircut, the actions are the exact same actions, they speak the same thing at the same time, sir, yes, sir. They chant that cadence as they march along. They are all the same. But that's not what a body looks like. In fact, Paul says the exact opposite when he's talking about it in Romans. If the whole body were one thing over and over and over again, it would be bad. I'm paraphrasing. But if the whole body were an eye, how would you hear? If the foot said, you know what, I'm not a hand, so I'm not good enough, so I just quit. No. And Paul points out in Ephesians 4, the body has to have diversity in order to grow. But I'm afraid it's easier to create uniformity or to create a union than it is to create unity. And so we settle for one of the extremes, which are both unhealthy, because it's easier. It's easier to just say, look, everybody just come, sit in this, you don't have to get along, you don't have to think the same thing. We don't have to have the same, philosophy or theology or doctrine. Just make sure your check clears, right? Let's just all, go along to get along. And then there's no way to have any growth and development from that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got this uniformity. Look, if everybody just acts the same way, then we'll get along. There won't be any arguing. There won't be any fussing. There's no disagreement. Everybody just does and thinks and says the same thing, and it's simple. And yeah, it'll be really peaceful, but nobody's going to grow in that. See, unity gives us the opportunity to grow and build ourselves up in love. Man, that's tough. Because the only way unity works in the face of diversity is for you to learn how to put up with somebody else's difference and still stick with them. Still stick to them. And that can be the hardest thing in the world. The definition that I found that I liked for unity is loyalty and solidarity in the face of diversity. You bring your talents and your abilities to the table. You bring your likes and dislikes to the table. You bring your perspectives and your experiences to the table, and they're all vastly different. But we sit down at the same table and we stick together. We hammer it out. We work through the complications and the conflicts and the times when we rub each other the wrong way, and we stay on it and we don't get up and walk away, because we know that that gives us the opportunity to do what Proverbs tells us. As iron sharpens iron. Right? The literal Hebrew is like our faces sharpen each other's faces. But it's like we get the opportunity to make each other better. I like the rock tumbler personally. Did you ever have that, science experiment or something? You can get them at Harbor Freight right now. You can spend a little money or a lot of money, and you can buy this little machine, and you take these rocks that you pick up off the ground, and you throw a bunch of rocks in this little thing, and it just spins, and it spins, and it spins, and it spins, and it spins, and then it spins some more. And after a few days, or however long it is, you go back and you open that up, and what's inside looks completely different than what you put in it. Because over that time, what you pull out are these beautiful, shining, colorful, smooth stones that can be used for decorative purposes or projects or just all kinds of neat stuff. But they didn't look like that when you put them in. When you put them in the tumbler, they had rough edges, and they were gritty, and they were dirty, and they were messed up, and there was no shine or luster because you couldn't see what was underneath. Well, what got them there? Crashing and slamming and banging into one another because they couldn't get out. Nowadays, we live in a multicultural society that tells us if you don't like something that's going on in the group that you're in, you know what you do? You drop them. You push them to the side, and you just go over here and you find you another group. And you just keep floating around like that little butterfly from flower to flower to flower until you find the one that will let you do and be and think whatever you want to do and be and think. And you don't have to worry about changing. You don't have to worry about growing. You don't have to worry about... And it's only when we're forced to stick together that we can confront the ways that we need to improve. You will not experience growth in your own individual private life until you learn how to stick with a group of people that challenge you and that sometimes you don't necessarily enjoy what they have to say to you. But nowadays we just quit. We just walk away. We find another group. There's an online chat. There's another, the attention span, all of these things that take us away over and over again, and we have to figure out how to fight against that. Because there's too many ways to divide ourselves. There's too many ways to segregate ourselves. There's too many ways to split one another up over and over and over again. And we show preference to the people that we like, and we turn our backs on the people that we don't like or don't want to get along with, and that prevents us from being able to be who God wants us to be. These boundaries that we set up. In Galatians, Paul talks about Jesus tearing down the walls of hostility. You think about what those walls are. What are the walls that we put up? What are the walls that exist that the reason, the purpose for putting them in place is to separate us from them? Because we do it all the time. Tonight, if I could challenge you with anything specifically, the thing that I would challenge you with the most is to spend some personal reflection time thinking about who the us's and the them's are in your life. Because if you don't think you've got them, you really need to spend some time thinking about this. And you might need to get some outside help for you to see clearly. Jesus has that little thing, that joke that he makes about looking at the speck that's in your brother's eye, right? If you understand the concept of what I'm talking about when I talk about us and them, and you can look at how there's a group of people out there and they're really good at, building those walls and putting those walls up. And you can see that. You can identify that in them, but you don't see it in yourself. Jesus talks about that plank. And that's a proof that that it's something that you struggle with. If you say they are really good at putting up those walls, but I don't have that problem, you've already created an us and a them. Do you see? Do you see that? And so it's not something that in a group I can point for you and say, here's what it is. I can tell you what some of them are. I'm going to throw a couple of them out. But I would really encourage you to spend some time introspectively thinking about who are the us's in my life and the them's. And there's probably several different groups. But you've got people that, yeah, these are my people. So if you're not one of these, then you're a them. Who are your people? Now, I'm not telling you not to have people. I mean, even Jesus had thousands of followers. He had fewer disciples. He had fewer apostles. He had a smaller inner circle. And then he had a disciple whom he loved. Does that mean he didn't love the other ones? No, he loved them all. He said, I've loved them, I've kept them unto the end. But there was one that was closer. And so, yeah, we have these rings like a bullseye. You know, we're at the center of that. And there are some people that we are closer to, that we let in. We are more vulnerable with them. Absolutely. There's a really important, distinction between the people that are closest to you and the people that are farthest out. But wherever a person falls in that target, closest to you or farthest away from you, you've got to be aware of two words that the Bible uses to keep us in check, to keep you in line. How do you treat people? There's two words that the Bible uses that we've got to avoid because the Bible tells us they're dangerous. The fancy word, the technical term is partiality and enmity. We don't use either one of those words in everyday language. I don't know if I've ever said the word enmity outside of a pulpit in my life. That is a King James word if I've ever heard one, right? But these are two words that represent huge concepts that the Bible tells us we need to avoid. Enmity and partiality. In Matthew chapter 5, the end of Matthew chapter 5, verse 48 tells us that we should be perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. And it's tough to swallow that terminology. But when you look at it in its context, Jesus is saying, God sends his sun to shine on the just and the unjust. God sends the rain on the evil and the good. He doesn't show partiality. He is equal in his treatment of all people. That doesn't mean they get the same thing every time, but he treats them according to his own nature, and so he treats them all without partiality. He doesn't pick favorites. So he says, you need to be perfect as well. You need to be complete in how you treat everybody, whether they're close to you or far away from you. Don't show partiality. That is giving deferential treatment. That's giving better treatment to one person over another for some kind of reason. That's partiality. The Bible says, nope, don't go that way. The other end of the spectrum is enmity. Enmity is when you have a feeling about a certain person because of some wall of difference between you, and so you don't give them the treatment that they deserve. You don't treat them with the respect and the love and the grace that the Bible talks about because of that wall of difference, because they're a them. And that might be political, that might be racial, that might be financial, that might be based on sex or gender, that might be based on age. All right, these are some of these walls that we put up, and we start treating people differently. The Bible says don't do it. Acts chapter 10 and verse 34, God shows no partiality. When Peter is sitting on that rooftop in Acts chapter 10 and he has this vision where the sheet comes down, God shows no partiality. What God says is clean, don't call unclean. In James chapter 2, you need to make sure you're doing that. If somebody comes into your assembly and they're dressed in fine clothes and they look really good and you give them the seat of honor, and then somebody else walks through the other door and they're dressed in rags and you say, hey, you need to be on the floor. Evil intentions. You need to do better. As Christians, we need to understand that the thing that unites us is stronger than everything that divides us. the one thing that unites us is stronger than everything that divides us. If you're going to be walking with one another, then you'd better get over whatever those divisions are. You better learn to make the adjustments. Otherwise, the world won't see us as any different than anybody else walking down the street, and they won't have any interest in what we have to say. Thank you for listening tonight. I know the kids are going to start coming in. We're going to sing some songs together. Let's finish with a prayer as we wrap it up. Dear Heavenly Father, again, we thank you so much for this day. And as Paul told us in Ephesians chapter 2, we thank you for the good things that you have prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Help us to seek those things out and to look for ways to do them, to walk in your will and your way. And as we see others around us who are attempting to walk the same way, help us to link up together. Help us to join hands, to join hearts, and to walk in unity. Help us to be the kind of people you want us to be. Help us to be like that city that's been set on a hill so that we can shine like stars in the night sky. Forgive us when we fall. Give us the strength to stand and try again. We offer this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.